Today we are starting this new sermon series called Devoted to the End. Deepening intimacy with Jesus at his table. If you are an immigrant like me, you know that for us, we always have a goodbye day, right? Like we are doing here today with Timoteo and Fernanda, all of us, we have a day for a goodbye. Usually, these days, they are not so pleasant. They are not so happy because we love people. We have affections. And when we need to separate from each other, this is painful. I still remember the day that I left Rio de Janeiro 8 years ago. And I have a picture here to share with you about this last moment there with my family. This was December 27, 2016. And this was my goodbye there. And I still remember the words, the hugs, and what I heard that day. I still remember that. This is still with me. And I'm talking about that because the passage that we have here, John 13 until John 16, they are considered a goodbye discourse, a farewell discourse. Because in here we have the last moments of Jesus with his disciples. After 3 years walking and talking and living together, they now are having their last moment together, the last night. It's, you see from these 4 chapters, 13, 14, 15, and 16 in John, many times Jesus is saying, hey, I am going away. For example, verse 33, he says, 13:33, little children, yet a little while I am with you. And then on 14:19, he says, yet a little while, and the world will see me no more. And then 16:16, he says, a little while, and you will see me no longer. And 16:16, I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I am leaving the world and going to the Father. So you see that in many parts of this passage, this part, Jesus is saying, hey, I am leaving you for a while. The words that Jesus will say here, they gain importance because of that context. When you have just these final moments, you don't waste your time with trivialities. You go straight to the point. You need to say something. And this is what Jesus is saying here. You know, the scene is very known. Jesus is in this place called Upper Room in Jerusalem. This is the last night, the night before Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus is there around the table with the 12 disciples in that place. Some people say that this was John Mark's house in Jerusalem. Some people say this was a very big house and there was this upper room and Jesus was there for Passover, celebrating this festival with the Jews. and with the 12 apostles. We can say that John 13 to 16 is a kind of holy of holies in the New Testament. When we enter that scene and we are allowed to see what happened there, we need to take off our sandals, because this is a holy land. We will understand what's happening there. Based on what Luke says, the Gospel of Luke says about this moment, we know that there was a dispute. Luke chapter 22, verse 24 says that a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Notice, Jesus is saying, hey, this is a goodbye. I am leaving you. I am going back to the Father. And maybe they thought, okay, if Jesus is leaving, we need to find the best one here to be the leader from now on. And they were discussing about that. Hey, which one of us is the most qualified disciple? Is the greatest? Jesus saw everything there. And then the text says that the very first thing that happens in that room was a very embarrassing situation. This is what we know as the Jesus coming to wash the feet of his disciples. Jesus, in that place, arose and took this water and came washing one by one. And it's evident in that scene that there is a kind of embarrassment, a very strong embarrassment. And this is evident by Peter's reaction. Because when Jesus comes to Peter, Peter says, Lord, do you wash my feet? He was very embarrassed. And why is that? Because in that culture, although this was a very common thing to wash the feet, this was a very low activity. A rabbi was not supposed to ask a disciple to wash his feet. Never. Because it was maybe the greatest humiliation in that culture. This was something for the lowest of the lowest slaves. They were the ones with that responsibility. And I believe that when Jesus entered that room, that house with the disciples, it was the tradition. They needed to wash their feet. But it seems that this didn't happen there. Maybe because they didn't have slaves there. We don't know. But in fact, maybe one was looking at each other and say, hey, who will wash the feet? And then Jesus, the master, Jesus, the highest authority there, the rabbi, the leader, the Lord, decides to do that. And there is embarrassment because they are saying, hey, it's not you, Jesus. You cannot do that. It's not your task. Please don't do that. You are embarrassing us. So the first reaction is embarrassment. But when we read the text, there is a precious lesson in here. There's a teaching. There is no doubt that Jesus was teaching something to his disciples in this situation. And maybe the most precious and important lesson that he had for them. Remember that Jesus was preparing them for their mission in the world. For 3 years, Jesus was preparing them, giving opportunities to them, teaching them, walking with them. And now that Jesus is in the final moment, the last words, the first thing is that, hey, you cannot forget this. This is a lesson to you. You see, verse 12 says, do you understand what I have done to you? So Jesus wanted to make this a lesson to them. Do you understand that? And he says, for I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. So Jesus wanted to imprint in them, in their mindsets, a concept that if they wanted to be Jesus' disciples, they needed to go and to do like Jesus was doing here. Like I said, when we think about washing the feet, this is just considering the custom of that time, a very humiliating act. But when we see what John says here from verse 1 to 3, we understand even better what Jesus was teaching them. So I'd like to focus in here on verses 1 to 3, because in there we have the context. The question I'd like to answer now in preparation for communion today is that in what setting and context did Jesus choose to wash his disciples' feet? Because it was not a common feet washing. No, there is more in here based on the context of the passage. And what John says about that, let's see. Imagine that you are having now a very high privilege to have access to something that happened not in the middle of the multitudes, the crowds, but in a closed room. Jesus and the 12, only them there. And because of John, you have access to what happened there. What John says, first of all, there are 4 details in here for the context. The first one is that John says that Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father. So remember, at least 2 or 3 times in John, Jesus had said, it's not my time. My hour has not yet come. But now, Jesus knew that his hour had come. He said, no, now is the time. The time has come. And when you go to the chapter 12, just before 13, on verse 23, the end of this chapter 12, we read that Jesus said, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So Jesus connects the hour with the crucifixion, the cross. Because Jesus came from the Father for this hour. And he says here, verse 27, Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. He came for this hour. So when we read in John chapter 13, verse 1, that Jesus knew that his hour had come, this means he knew that this was the time for the cross. He was walking to the cross, and this was the time. It's important that we understand that. Now imagine that you go to a doctor, and the doctor tells you that you have no more than a month. You have a month, and then you are done. What should you do? Think about your month, right? What strikes me here is that Jesus, in his last hours, he is concerned about others. And we see this pattern in here. Think about the cross. Jesus is in great agony, suffering at the cross, on the cross, and although he could be like, okay, this is my time, I need a me time now, okay, it's my hour, I need to process all this, right? But what he did, number one, he looked at the soldiers and he says, Father, forgive them. He's concerned about the soldiers. And then there's a criminal right beside Jesus. And Jesus has a dialogue with the criminal. And Jesus says, hey, today you will be with me in paradise. And more than that, Jesus sees his mom, Mary, there. And he's concerned about her. Who will take care of her? And he says to John, right beside Mary, hey, John, this is your mom now. Take care of her. So you see, Jesus in his last moments, when he could be concerned only about himself, he's thinking about others. I don't know about you, but when I suffer, I need to close the door of my room and say, okay, I don't want to talk to anybody. I want to have my time, right? Because I am suffering. I have the right to suffer. But what Jesus is saying here is that, and this is the first circumstance around the washing the feet washing. In his last night, he serves. He takes care of others. We have a great lesson in here. It was his last moments, but he was serving others, not himself. Second, verse 1 says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So John connects what Jesus is doing here, washing his disciples' feet. He's connecting this act to love. Because we can serve out of many different motives. For example, we can serve out of interest. Next weekend, probably I'll have my moving. And sometimes when people ask me to help them, I always think, well, I will help them because when I move, I will need them. You see how sinful I am? Sometimes we serve because we say, okay, I'll serve this because in the future, I'll need this person. So out of interest, we serve others. Or then we serve because we have a kind of obligation. You are working, you are an employee, and you need to serve in your job. If not, you are fired. So you serve out of obligation. And we could talk about many other reasons why people serve. But Jesus is, we read in John that Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Which means he loved them to the last consequences. It was a great humiliation to wash their feet. But because he loved them, he was willing to go through this humiliation. And this is exactly what we do when we love someone. If you love your family, let me ask something to you. What hardship or humiliation would you endure for your family? If you need to do something, I would say unorthodox for our culture. If you need to humiliate yourself to save your son or to save your daughter, would you? I am sure you could do that because you love them. When we love someone, we put pride aside. We go to the last consequences because we love. So notice the title of our sermon series, Devoted to the End. The title comes from this verse. We need and we can be devoted to the end because he loved us to the end. Our devotion is not a devotion to be loved, but because we are loved. Devotion is not a bargain. You are devoted to God because he loved you to the end. So this is the second point. Service flows from love. Must flows from love, not out of interest. Third, verse 2, John says that Jesus is about to wash his disciples' feet, knowing, and the text says here, verse 2, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And there is no evidence in the text that Jesus washed his disciples' feet, but skipped Judas. It's evident by the text that Jesus also washed Judas' feet, knowing that he would betray him in the next hours. And there is a great lesson because Jesus will say, hey, do you understand what I did? Do the same. What Jesus is saying is that we are called to serve even our enemies, those who will betray us. I know, this is a high-level thing I am saying here. And this is a very difficult thing. But this is not different from what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus said, love your enemy. This is not different. What Jesus is doing here is exactly what he said to others. He is loving, he is serving the enemy. And we learn here a precious lesson to us. This true service is defined more by the giver's willingness than the recipient's worthiness. Let me repeat that. True service is defined more by the giver's willingness than the recipient's worthiness. Because sometimes we don't serve because we say, hey, you don't deserve that. We don't forgive because we say, you don't deserve that. But look at Jesus. Jesus served even Judas. He put himself under Judas in here. So this is the third aspect of the context that brings even more light to what Jesus is doing. And fourth, the last one, verse 3 says, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, under that circumstance and that knowledge, he washed his disciples' feet. But I don't know about you, but if I am reading this passage, I see a very clear contrast in here. Because right before talking about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, he is saying that Jesus knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. Jesus had a very clear conscience about who he was. All-powerful God, the Creator. Jesus knew that all authority was under his feet. Jesus knew that. He knew who he was. Which means that when Jesus is serving, he is not making the cost-benefit equation. He's not saying, okay, what can I have, what's the gain with that? What can I gain in washing their feet? It was not for social media. The doors were closed, and we only know that because John wrote that years later. Jesus knew who he was, and he served. And we learn in here that when you serve, when I serve, this is not a sign that we are inferior. By the way, when we read the Bible, we understand and we know a God who helps us, who serves us. Think about that. Of course, we are God's servants. But in Isaiah 64, we read there that from of old, no one has heard or perceived by the ear, no eye has seen a God besides you who works for those who wait for him. God works for us. And he doesn't sleep. We read this in the book of Psalms. God is working all the time for you and for me. He gives us all we need to live. And there is a passage in here, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, I was never aware about this passage until this week when I had to go through this passage. And look what Luke said in this parable. Luke chapter 12, verse 37. Jesus is talking about the second coming. And he says, "Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them." And this week I was wondering, imagining something. In heaven, we'll be worshiping the Lord forever. But would be the case that when we are there, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be and will serve us at the table. Can you imagine that? In a moment, we'll have communion here. We'll have communion together. And it's important that you understand that we are guests around this table. And Jesus himself is the one who is serving you and me. So Jesus is serving us in the same way that he served his disciples washing their feet. Think about that. He's our helper. So Jesus wanted to establish in here a new pattern. They were discussing, and I'd like to finish with this, they were discussing who of them, who was the greatest. And Jesus is giving them a no words lesson. Without saying anything, Jesus is washing their feet. Because Jesus is establishing a new concept of greatness. What Jesus is saying here is that greatness in the kingdom is not measured by how many people serve you, but by how you serve others. So the question is not how many people serve you. The question is how many people you are serving. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? This is the inversion that Jesus is establishing here. What are the lessons for us? And we will celebrate communion. What are the lessons? Number one, we are called, every one of us, we are called to serve. Number two, service demands humility. And I love this quote from Tim Keller when he says that humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. There's a different thing. So to serve others, you think of yourself less. And like Jesus, even in the midst of your suffering and pain, you need to think about others, what others are in need. There is what Henry Nouwen said, downward mobility. We live in a world where everyone wants to go up, to prosper, to succeed, to be in the highest place. But we learn from Jesus that the true disciple, he needs to go down, downward mobility. Third, service must flow from love, not out of other interests. And fourth, true greatness is measured not by how many serve you, but by how you serve others. So we can finish saying that when Jesus brought this passage he is saying, hey, I have a final lesson to you. You heard many things that I taught you, but now you need to understand something. A Christian leader must be a servant leader. A Christian leader is not the boss. A Christian leader should be the one that are willing to serve others. This is the lesson. If you want to be like me, Jesus, you want to go that way. This is what Jesus is saying here. Look at me. I know who I am. I know where I am going to. But I'm doing this because I love you guys. So you should do the same for your brothers and sisters. And this was in his disciples' minds. And how do we know that? How we know that? The final verse for us, 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter is talking here to elders, the elders of the church. Peter is giving instructions to Christian leaders at the church. And see here, verse 5, what Peter says. 1 Peter 5:5, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And it's very interesting that when you go to the Greek sentence, this expression, clothe yourselves, could be the same word to describe a work apron used by slaves. So what Peter is saying here, literally in Greek, is, hey, clothe, put on your work apron to serve others. And you can ask, from where Peter brought this image? From there, John chapter 13. He is remembering Jesus, and he's saying, hey, if you are a leader at the church, you should be the first one to take the initiative to wash the others' feet, because this is what we are called to do. Let me pray, and then we'll finish this first message. And I encourage you to think about ways that you could serve at the church, ways that you could serve better at your home, ways that you could serve better in your service, in your workplace. You know, sometimes we are at home and we are demanded, we are asked to help, to serve, but sometimes we just say, okay, I'm so tired. Think about Jesus. Let's all think about Jesus. A disciple is a servant. And we should learn that. This is the first lesson. If you want to be devoted to the end, we are called to be servants in this world.